Okay, so this lecture series, with the whole module, is divided into 3 sections. Each section has 3 lectures and 3 seminars, so 9 in total. The first part is all about the avant-garde, but not what Clement Greenberg meant by the avant-garde. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, who's Clement Greenberg? And this is where we start with your education. The lecture series really is an alternative art history, alternative to the mainstream narrative of the last 100 years. So it kind of assumes that you know the mainstream art history narrative of the last 100 years, but I know that not all of you do. So if you don't know who Clement Greenberg was, write his name down and find out. It's not that you're going to be tested on this, it's that you need to know. But I'm going to tell you quite a bit about him now as kind of like back information, filling in what this lecture series is not about, because what it's in opposition to. So you need to understand who Clement Greenberg was and why he is important. So he used the term avant-garde, but he was talking about abstract expressionism. So you might have heard of Clement Greenberg because he's the main art critic who championed Jackson Pollock and the abstract expressionists like Willem de Kooning, Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, and others. Large-scale abstract paintings from America in the mainly sort of the 1940s and 50s. And he was very influential on art history. I am not talking about what he means by avant-garde at all in this lecture series. I'm talking about what a German theorist called Peter Berger means by avant-garde, which is Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism, pretty much. So Berger felt that the avant-garde was something necessarily radical and new. That's kind of what it means, avant-garde, out front. The vanguard, it's a military term, means at the front of the army. And because it's at the front and it's making new ground, you can't repeat it. And therefore he criticizes a term, an art movement in the 60s called neo-avant-garde. He says, how can you have a neo-avant-garde? You can't repeat it. Although we might not actually call it a neo-avant-garde, the second section of this module, the second 3 lectures, is about what I'm calling the real neo-avant-garde. And I argue in my research and in this lecture series that the avant-garde can repeat, can carry on, and that you find it in performance art, happenings, social sculpture, and there are examples there, I argue, that merit the name neo-avant-garde. So the text on the slide is what I've said in different words. Okay, back to Greenberg then. So the reason that we're doing this and we're looking at Peter Berger is that Greenberg's massively influenced art history, but he didn't really write about Dada, Surrealism or Futurism because it didn't fit with his narrative. In fact, going right back to basics, assuming that you know nothing, history is not just a factual account of what happened. It's got the word story in it, and people construct narratives and stories, and they leave things in, and they put things in and leave things out. And it had this idea, and it didn't really fit with Dada, Surrealism, and Futurism, so he kind of ignored them. He traced what he called the flattening of the picture plane, starting with Impressionism, and then he went through post-Impressionism to Cubism, and then to abstraction. He said, there's a history. It starts off very realistic, and it gets more and more flat and more abstract. But that didn't happen for Dada, Surrealism and Futurism. So he kind of ignored it. But that's been reassessed recently, as you'll have seen, and many art forms today are looking back to Dada, Surrealism and Futurism. That's kind of what the whole first 3 lectures and seminars are about. So here's a quotation from Clement Greenberg. He said, "The picture plane itself grows shallower and shallower, flattening out and pressing together fictive planes of depth until they meet upon the real and material plane, which is the actual surface of the canvas." Clear? Maybe not. What did he mean by that? I'll explain with pictures. This is a painting by Titian. It's a Renaissance painting, and it's called the Venus of Urbino. Now, you need to know in arts what picture planes are. Picture planes, you can understand them very easily as foreground, middle ground and background, but you could have more picture planes. So we might say that this lady lying on the bed is one picture plane. Behind her, to the kind of the top left quarter, it looks like a wall. It's a bit dark on my screen. It could be a curtain. I'll just brighten my screen up a bit, that's better. That's another picture plane, that wall. Behind that is another picture plane, which is a child going into a box and an adult standing next to that child, and the wall is behind them. Behind that is a window, and if you look very carefully, you can see a tree behind that. Behind that will be the clouds. These are all different picture planes. So there's a lot of depth in this picture, and there's also perspective, and you can see the perspective very clearly on the floor. The floor tiles are drawn in linear one-point perspective, going off towards a vanishing point. So there's an illusion of depth. What Titian, like most or all Renaissance painters, is doing is trying to create an illusion that a flat surface, the canvas, is actually 3D and going in and off into space. But also it's 3D in other ways. So if you look at the body of the Venus, the lady, it's curved using tone and shading. It's 3D. You're going to see what I mean more when I show you the next Venus painting. This is Manet's Olympia, and it's clearly based on Titian's Venus of Urbino, but it's a bit different. So you can see that the figure is a bit flatter. She does have some shading, but it's kind of like she's got an outline and she's a bit flatter, almost like a mannequin. We still have the screen behind her in the top left sort of quarter, but behind that is a curtain that's cut off the back, so we don't have the linear perspective, we don't have the wall, we don't have the window behind it. So that's what Greenberg looked at this and said, well, it's similar, isn't it, to the one before, but it's flatter. He's taken out the perspective, it's flattened down, and Greenberg saw this as a trend. And it doesn't have to be just in interiors or landscapes or anything where you would have linear perspective, but also he said from Manet he sort of moved into Cézanne, post-impressionism. The right-hand side of your screen is a self-portrait by Cézanne that's beginning to get more kind of blocky and more abstract, and then it moves into, say, Picasso, and you can see they're beginning to look more like mannequins than people, and they're flatter. So that's Greenberg's narrative in a nutshell, and it ends up, I won't show you examples of abstraction, but it ends up, he's kind of saying this is a good thing that we have photography which has perspective and is illusory. That's fine for photography, but painting is not photography. So with the invention of photography, we don't need to pretend to be a photograph. Painting becomes aware of itself. It says, I'm not a photograph, I'm not realistic, I am a painting, I am paint on a surface. And the best painting, he says, Greenberg says, acknowledges that. So it embraces its flatness, it embraces brushstrokes, It embraces what paint can do, drips maybe, or whatever, and it becomes self-aware as paint. And in that as well, it abstracts the essence of art, of picture making, of painting, which is like the X factor. People like Greenberg think that all paintings are abstract in a way. They're all just paint on a surface, colour, shapes. But if you can abstract that down to its basic ingredients, just blocks or squares or whatever, that will be the most pure form of art, the best form of art, according to Greenberg. So that's the backstory. That's like the prologue to the lecture. And we're going to start this lecture series with Dada, which began in Zurich, and hopefully you've all already watched the video that I asked you to watch last night, Gaga for Dada, presented by Vic Reeves, which explains this history of Dada. But we're going to look at a particular aspect of it, which is provocations and imaginations. It's how it engages with publics. So we're not going to look at, for example, Hannah Hock's photo montage, which is in the television documentary that you've watched. So you already know that it began in Zurich in 1916. You can see it says it on this photograph. When I first came to Lincoln and I had to put together this lecture, one of the lecturers that I was working with, John Lawrence, said, "Oh, over the summer I went to Voltaire. Here's a photograph. This is his photograph. You can still go there today." And it began in 1916. Well, what was the world like in 1916? You have to ask. What was happening? And it was quite a revolutionary time. So in the build-up to the First World War, which began in 1914, in the build-up in England, we had the suffragette movement. And the suffragettes were very militantly fighting for the vote. Very militantly, as in they set off bombs, they slashed the Venus, the Rokeby Venus, another Venus painting in the National Gallery. They hurled an axe at an MP. They were quite violent, quite aggressive, but they stopped in 1914 to support the war efforts. They felt that it was more important to support the war efforts, the World War. Also in 1916, in Ireland, there was the Easter Rising. The Easter Rising was the first attempt at a kind of revolution for Irish independence, and it failed. The British put it down, shot all the leaders of the Easter Rising, and put an end to that for a bit. By about 1921, the Irish independence movement had gathered pace again, and Ireland was partitioned between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. That's 1916. 1917 afterwards is the Russian Revolution, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the lecture. So they overthrow the Tsar, cut off his head, kill all of his family, and form a communist. So there are revolutions in women's politics, Irish independence, in Russia, and the war, of course, is in full swing in 1916, and some people think it's crazy. Mechanized warfare, it's the most efficient warfare we've had so far. We've got the machine guns, we've got tanks even by 1916, and it's just a very efficient way of murdering millions of people. And if you've seen documentaries about the First World War, of course, soldiers were told to walk slowly in a line towards machine gun fire. And that seems crazy. And if they didn't, they were shot for being cowards. So some people thought this was mad and became draft dodgers. They refused to fight, and they left their countries, France, Britain, Germany maybe, and they went to Switzerland, neutral Switzerland. That's why they went to Switzerland. And they embraced this idea that if the world's gone mad, maybe we should make mad art and throw it back at the world. They embrace the idea that maybe progress is not a good thing. Maybe there's a myth, an Enlightenment myth of progress. It's not always getting better. It's not always improving. Just because we invent a great machine, like a machine gun, maybe that's not a good thing. In fact, this maybe started a bit earlier when the Titanic sank in 1912. So the idea was we can do anything. We can create a ship that is unsinkable, and it sank. We can do anything. We can create great machinery, but it's used to murder people. So it's not only that, it's that the Dadaists thought this undermines our faith in everything, in the whole of society, because if Western society is so great, so superior, remember this is a colonial period where in the West we're kind of saying it's okay to go and colonize Africa because we are better than the Africans. We're more civilized, but actually are we, if we're just creating this mass bloody war where we're sat in muddy trenches gunning each other down? Is reason, the scientific ideas of the Enlightenment that make us so civilized, are they actually good if they lead to carnage and a kind of arrogance that we think we can just take over the world, literally with colonialism, also with boats that are unsinkable? So here's a summary of what I've just said. Here's an image. You might recognize it from Blackadder. It's a famous TV series with Rowan Atkinson and Stephen Fry there. And here he is pretending to go mad so that he doesn't have to go over the trenches and walk towards machine gun fire. So here's a summary. They doubted the Western Enlightenment belief in progress and thought that reason and logic are bourgeois capitalist kind of ideas, and that art should be unreasonable, illogical, and anti-bourgeois, anti-art, against all the values, cultural values that came before them. And the example in the video, one of the first performances was Hugo Ball reciting Caruana, a poem, dressed in a cubist costume in the Cabaret Voltaire, and it was all just nonsense and gibberish. Vic Reeves recreates this, you will remember. And this is important because performance art doesn't exist really until the 60s and 70s, but actually you'll see there's lots of proto-performance in the avant-garde. So it's not just a poem, it's a costume. It's not just a costume and a poem, it's a performance in front of a live audience. There were female Dadaists. You've seen Hannah Hock, for example, in the video. Sophie Taubert here is doing another crazy performance, an improvised dance in a cardboard costume with a dozen balalaika players playing along. Balalaika is a stringed instrument. So Dada invented new forms of arts that are highly influential today, and they include mock rituals, gibberish, using parody as an art form. They did performances simultaneously in English, German, and French, all talking over each other so that no one could hear. But I mean, it sounds like a load of rubbish, but the English, the French, and the Germans were at war and not really listening to each other, not really fighting, fighting and not listening to each other. In that context, perhaps you can understand the absurdity of standing on stage and just talking in your own languages at each other. It also sort of speaks to nationalism. I'm going to speak in my language because it's the best. You listen. They deconstructed language. They used absurdity in art as a response to an absurd world. My PowerPoint's just stopped. Here we go. Nihilism, that's kind of like a fatalistic negativity, that you can look that up. and they were against bourgeois culture, against the ruling classes. Basically, were the officer classes in the war, the generals, and they kind of some people, especially in Russia in the revolution, saw this as a bourgeois war. So they wanted to start art again from scratch and to rekindle a childlike innocence. So we're going to move on from those kind of absurd cabaret proto performances in Zurich, and after the war, artists went back to their home countries. So the German artists went back to Berlin, and they continued with Dada. And here is the first International Dada Exchange, an exhibition from 1920. So the war ended in 1918. This is 1920. And if you look just above where it says 1920, you can just about make out a poster that says Dada ist politisch. So Dada is political. And we're not really going to talk about many of these artworks in this exhibition because they are pictures, and we're going to look more at how people engage with publics, provoke publics, as you're doing in frameworks as well. But at the very top of this image, you can see just about there is a mannequin, a figure, hanging on the ceiling with a sign hanging off of it. And I know you can't see it very well, but trust me, it's there. And I've got a recreation of that because that artwork's now lost on the next slide. That's what it looks like. It's called Prussian Archangel, and it's a German soldier in a Prussian uniform. Prussia was a major country that became part of a German confederation in about 1870, I think. And they're mocking the war, they're mocking the military, and the Prussians are quite well sort of famous for being pro-military. This is radical because of what happened after the war in Germany. So in 1919, the year before that exhibition, on the 6th of January, I've missed a bit. On the 5th of January, there was a big strike. 100,000 people went on strike, and people marched through the streets, even occupied buildings, and Germany looked to be revolutionary. Remember that in just 1917, Russia had a revolution and killed its monarchy and became a communist country. So this is serious. It looks like Germany's going to have a revolution, and the Spartacists, who are communists, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, tried to capitalize on this moment and overthrow the government and form a communist country in Germany. In reaction to that, the next day, the government employed 3,000 Freikorps that you can see on the right of your screen here to put down the uprising. So the Freikorps are kind of militia or mercenaries. They were ex-soldiers, so the war's just finished. They're still armed. They hate communists. They're trained for battle, and they've got equipment. They've got rifles, machine guns, and artillery. It took them about a few days to put down the uprising and kill the leaders. Karl Liebknecht, they chased him through the streets, shot him in the head on the 15th of January and dumped his body at the morgue. Rosa Luxemburg, they beat her to death and dumped her in the canal on the same day. Scary stuff. That couldn't happen today, could it? I can't help but see parallels with Trump's militia. You might have seen on the news in Portland and in other cities, they've taken over the streets completely. The army and the police are nowhere to be seen, and they are also guarding public buildings, overseeing the election. It's quite intimidating, isn't it? And They are, of course, armed. So, just 2 days after Luxemburg and Leibniz were murdered, the Dadaists started planning a march, which took place a month later, on the 15th of February. The march was a highly confrontational, provocative act. Nick Heath, who's the founder of the Anarchist Federation, describes how the Dadaists, and I'm reading from the screen now, marched into the working class neighbourhoods, singing anti-militarist songs, and were met with much amusement. As the Dadaist Walter Mehring was to say, our Dadaist procession was greeted with delight, as spontaneous as the on danse of the Paris mob in front of the Bastille. For this, the authorities arrested them for seeking to bring the armed forces into contempt. And one of them, John Hartsfield, got 8 months in jail. The potentially incendiary tactics adopted by the Dadaists included the route of the march. So they retraced the funeral procession of Karl Liebknecht. They marched down the same route whilst playing an old Prussian national anthem. Remember, Germany is now a country, but Prussia was a big part of it. It's the part where Berlin is. So they played the old Prussian national anthem, which is a funeral lament, so a slow march. And they parodied the Freikorps funeral marches. They're taking the piss. And I felt that this is reminiscent of the antagonistic retracing of politically sensitive routes, including funeral processions, by the Orange Order in Northern Ireland today. You've probably seen the Orange Order marches in Northern Ireland, but you might not realise that they deliberately go through certain neighbourhoods and retrace certain routes to assert their right to walk on the streets, but also to provoke Catholic communities. Indeed, it's not just me that makes this parallel. There's a young art historian called Gavin Grindon, and he describes the march as the Dada March as combining religious, military, and political forms in a public performance. He goes on to describe how the collaborators, such as a brass band and a horse and carriage that the Dadaists had hired, escaped the attack because they were assaulted by the Freikorps and the police. They escaped by covering over any incriminating posters. They had to dump their musical instruments, and then they had to seek refuge in pubs. They dived into pubs to hide. Dada publications were seen as dangerous enough to ban. During the march, the Dadaists distributed copies of the first issue of their satirical pamphlets, come newspaper, which is called Jedermann sein eigener Fußball, which means every man his own football. This was published bi-monthly. According to Gavin Grindon, the participants had already sold, wait for it, 7,600 copies by the time they encountered the arresting officers at Alexanderplatz. According to the Tate curator, Matthew Gale, the newspaper was confiscated immediately on publication for urging renewed revolutionary activities. Therefore, a compelling case can be made that Dadaists, who were pacifists, remember, started out against the First World War, are in fact militant. They're pacifists, they don't want war, but they are seen as calling for a revolution or incitement to violence. And they were prepared to go to prison for their cause. We know this because the satirical author and Dadaist Walter Mehring proclaimed, he was there, he proclaimed, "We carried a supply of stickers saying, 'Hurrah, Dada,' specifically for sticking on the walls of police cells after they were arrested." So the Dadaists were prepared to be arrested, and they were. and a load of them got 8-month prison sentences, but all of which were quashed on appeal, except for one, Hartsfeld, who went to prison for 8 months. Now, both the accounts that I've looked at, Nick Heath and Gavin Grindon, they show that the Dadaists were quite revolutionary in Berlin and prepared to go to prison. But what about in Paris? In Paris, there was no revolution, and the Dadaist movement was different. Nonetheless, we still see a move away from the cabaret performances, standing up in a bar or restaurant, pub, and performing to people sitting at tables, a move away from that and onto the streets, into the public sphere, directly engaging with publics who might not even want to be engaged with. The Dadaists did excursions, like tours around the city, visits to bizarre places, like a graveyard. In April 1921, the Dadaist André Breton, along with Tristan Tzara and others, organised a tour of the church of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre in Paris, or rather the graveyard, which at the time was used as a rubbish dump. In the flyer for the event that you saw on the previous slide, they billed it as one of several planned tours that, quote, set right the incompetence of suspicious guides by leading excursions and visits that have no reason to exist. Instead of drawing attention to picturesque sites or places of historical interest or sentimental value, the aim was to make nonsense of the social form of the guided tour, sort of mocking bourgeois ideals of saying, yes, look at this beautiful building, and they're saying, yes, come and look at this beautiful rubbish dump. This becomes influential as an artwork itself. You can see it's quite well attended, even though it's raining. Do you remember I said in the briefing that we're going to talk about documentation of artworks? And here you can see that we have some black and white photographs. Maybe they're not great quality. Maybe they didn't think of it as a documentable artwork. Maybe they thought of it as something that they do. And photography is fairly new. Let's take a photograph. But you'll see the documentation get better as it progresses. They also did a mock trial of an author called Maurice Barrès. The Barrès trial was advertised as a hearing of the author, whose book, Un homme libre, a free man, had been a great influence on Breton and Louis Aragon in their youth. Barrès had advocated anarchism, freedom, and total individualism. But more recently, he changed his colours and turned right-wing, nationalist, and in their eyes, bourgeois. So therefore, they've put him on trial for selling out and becoming right-wing. The aim of the trial, in Breton's words, was, quote, to determine the extent to which a man could be held accountable if his will to power led him to champion conformist values that diametrically opposed the ideas of his youth. Now, like the excursion or tour at the church, this event subverted a social form, in this case a trial, and it involved the public for the first time in a more active role, because the flyers invited 12 people to apply, 12 strangers to apply to sit on a jury and judge Barrès. The Dadaists dressed up in ceremonial outfits of judges, white robes, clerical caps. You can see that in the image there. They were dressed in red for the defence, black for the prosecution. Each member of the group had a specific role, and Barrès himself was invited to attend his trial, but he obviously didn't show up. So they made a dummy, which you can see in the middle there, like it looks like a ventriloquist dummy, and tried the dummy in his absence. The event's appropriation of the social form of the trial and its non-confrontational collaboration with the public point to a distinct break with the performances that came before it, and is different to the Berlin March because it's more collaborative and the public are participating in this more. It marks a turning point in Dada performance and a step towards Surrealism. André Breton ends up forming the Surrealist movement, becoming more and more important in Dada. His intellectualized approach is dominating the more anarchic provocations of people like Francis Picabia and Tristan Tzara. In fact, Francis Picabia stormed out of the hall theatrically before the end of the trial, and Tristan Tzara did his best to disrupt it. During the event, he claimed he had no interest in Boris whatsoever and referred to him as the biggest pig of the century. Some Dadaists moved to New York. And in 1917, so earlier, the war's still on. Some of the artists went to Switzerland, some went to America. And in 1917, the American Society of Independent Artists held an exhibition in New York. Modern art's in full swing. And this was a radical group determined not to allow academic values to decide what counts as art and what doesn't. So the rules of the society were that any artist of any nationality could be a member. Their slogan was "No jury, no prizes." In order to avoid even the most unintentional hierarchy, Marcel Duchamp, a French artist, and an influential member of the group, is said to have suggested that the works for the exhibition should be hung in alphabetical order, and that they should start with a letter drawn at random from a hat. Because of this idea, they liked it so much, they elected him chair of the hanging committee. The group drew the line, however, so any artwork can be submitted and it's going to be hung in the same order with any other artwork. There's no hierarchy, everything's equal. But then they drew the line with an artwork submitted by someone called Richard Mutt. It was a urinal, and it was turned on its side and called Fountain. Because Fountain was not shown, Marcel Duchamp promptly resigned from the committee in protest, because he thinks why not? You're saying you've got no hierarchy and no rules here, and we're throwing out the rule book about what can be art. But this poor guy, Richard Mutt, submits a toilet, and you say it can't be art. Well, what are the rules then? It was later revealed that it was Duchamp who made Fountain, signing it R. Mutt, so that he could anonymously test the resolve of the hanging committee. Let's consider Fountain as a provocation. It mocked, not just by parodying fine art, but by being its stark opposite. It wasn't made by an artist. It's arguably ugly. It's utilitarian, meaning it's got a use. You're supposed to use it to pee in. Art doesn't usually have a use other than just to look at it. It's vulgar, and so on. It embodies something. Fountain is art only insofar as it is not art. It's quite complicated. It is what it is not, and that is why it is what it is. In other words, a toilet is just a toilet, but when you put it into an art gallery and propose that it's an artwork, it stops being just a toilet and it becomes a provocation. The provocation is, what is art? Who decides what is art? If it's in an art gallery, is it art? If you say it's not art, what rights, what authority do you have? What rules are there? What criteria are there for art? And the more you think about it, the more it begins to unravel. You might think it's not art, but when you come to define what art is, you end up excluding other things that maybe you do think are art. Duchamp said, "I threw the bottle rack and the urinal into their faces as a challenge, and now they admire it for its aesthetic beauty." So that's a kind of stupidity of it. It's supposed to be a provocation, and yet some people go into a gallery and look at it and go, maybe we're supposed to look at it as a beautiful object. That's not Duchamp's intention at all. There's a massive irony here, though, which is that the whole point of this is the beginning of ready-made art, found objects. Duchamp's invented a whole new art form comes after this. And a big argument about whether artists have to make the artwork or whether you could have it manufactured by somebody else. This is a manufactured object, porcelain. But it got lost. So in the 1960s, they had to make a replica to put into art galleries. They made more than one replica. But that particular urinal, we know which one it was because we've got photographs. So they had to employ an artist to make it by hand. It's kind of like a potter almost, making it out of clay. So the irony is the version that you see now has been made specifically as an art object. It is not what it appears. Now, so this whole lecture series is not about paintings. It's not about sculptures. It's about performance art, really. Ways that artists go out onto the streets and engage with the publics, provoke the publics. When I say performances, I don't mean, well, it could be, but not necessarily like acting, doing a performance. But it could be, yeah, let's recap, it could be standing up in a cabaret and reciting a poem whilst dressed in a funny costume. It could be organising a political provocative march. It could be organising nonsense tours to mock bourgeois values. It could be organising a trial. These are not really what you think of. They're not strictly performance arts, but they are performative insofar as it involves artists' bodies, it involves artists speaking, doing things, and it involves an audience. And Duchamp's fountain, you could say, well, that's a sculpture, so it doesn't really count. You couldn't do an essay about this. This is a good point to remind you that you should be thinking in the lectures, I might do my essay about this topic. Write down some ideas that you get from it, make some notes, and then you can pick one. But this does involve a public. It is different to a sculpture or a painting. A sculpture or a painting, let's take something we can all understand, a Van Gogh painting, the sunflowers. If you take it off the wall and put it into storage, it's still a painting. If someone finds it later, it's still a painting. If you take a urinal and put it into a store and someone finds it later, they might not even know it's art. So in a way, we might consider this to be the first ever piece of interactive art. In order for it to be art, it has to have an audience and a context. It has to be in an art gallery, and it has to provoke the audience by saying, is this art? Why not? It requires the audience to think about it and engage with it, to activate it. Without the audience to activate it, it's just a urinal. Okay, we're coming to the end. We have a summary, 2 pages of summary. Dada was born in neutral Switzerland as part of an anti-war movement, First World War, but it also meant completely reassessing the Western values that led towards a world war. After the war, the artists moved back to their own countries. They went to Berlin in Germany, Paris, New York. In Zurich, cabaret-style performances emerged, mixing poetry and theatre with art to create new art forms. In Berlin, Dada became overtly political. It took to the streets, it had a parade, procession, a protest march. These now became options for artists in the future. And you will see over the next 9 weeks that this was influential, and there are many artists over 100 years looking to the Dadaists. In Paris, Dada began a participatory turn, organising tours and the mock trial that required an audience to participate. You might not know this history of Dada, or you might not have known it before you came to the University of Lincoln. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, very influential art critics like Clement Greenberg ignored Dada because it didn't fit with his narrative. Do you remember that narrative of pictorial flattening and a move towards abstract art? He saw this in the context of progress, Enlightenment progress, art's getting better and better, and it's distilling down its essence until it becomes very abstract. But also, art galleries, not just art galleries, art historians, critics, so on, have historically preferred to focus on individual geniuses like Marcel Duchamp, or individual artworks that they could collect, display, and talk about. And that means they overlooked the group nature of Dada, but also Futurism and Surrealism, as we will see. So you get books on Dada, it talks about individuals and what they do, not so much about the collective. And this has led to accusations that they have recuperated. That's a specific word that I'm using for a specific reason, which I think in lecture 6 or so we're going to look at. But it means institutionalized the radical potential of the avant-garde. In other words, they've taken something that's genuinely radical, genuinely political, genuinely anarchic, and they've just taken the object, the photograph or individual artworks, put them in a gallery and displayed them in such a way that people don't even know about the provocation that comes behind it. They just look at it as a sculpture or a photograph. And if you think back to the quotation I gave you from Marcel Duchamp, he's unequivocal about that. He says, I threw this in their face as a provocation, but now they just look at its aesthetic quality.